Today we're going to be talking about market failure and a specific kind of market failure, externality. So when people talk about market failure, they typically describe it as, like the layperson describes it as, the market failed to achieve a result I personally liked. That's not market failure. That's way too subjective as to what market failure is. The market failure is when private decision-making fails to achieve an efficient allocation of scarce resources. We see market failures when we were talking earlier about public goods and commons, where what people individually want to do is at a disconnect to what we would like to see them do in general. But we can come up with lots of different examples of market failures. Like I said, the public goods is such an example, right? No one wants to contribute to it, and because no one wants to, everyone tries to free ride off everyone else, then the public good doesn't get provided, at least in some cases. Or in a commons, everyone tries to use the resource, exhausting it and dooming it, but no one contributes to it and maintains it. And no one has an incentive to be the sucker in the relationship. And so as a result, the commons resource fails. I'm recording this during the COVID-19 crisis of 2020, where everyone is trying to essentially practice social distancing in various extreme forms. And it's one of those cases where it's ripe for market failure, even though there's no explicit market here, right? There's no trading or buying and selling of things, at least on the social isolation thing. There is that essence of individual actions, and if individual actions pursue an aggregate result. And there's this problem of, if any one person, if we're all being confined to quarters, so to speak, we're all being pulled back and not interacting with others and practicing social distancing. Well, one person violating those rules doesn't create the pandemic. It doesn't make things worse. On the margin, no one person is going to make things worse. And so because what one person says to themselves, like, well, if I decide to go out and to violate the rules, that is not going to make things worse. Like in general, it's not going to make a big difference on the margin. But it would make a big difference to me if I'm able to go out, because I'll be able to get the benefits of going out. And so we have this kind of problem where everyone feels that way. And so we get a lot more people going out that normally we would like to see, right? And then that creates the problem, right? It's not a problem in the little margin, but it is a problem when you stack all those margins together and then you create a huge issue. This is an example of market failure, right? The individual actions of people fail to achieve an optimal result. And specifically, this kind of market failure falls into what we call externalities. An externality is a cost or benefit imposed on others that had no role in the decision making. Now, granted, it kind of makes more sense to talk in terms of a cost imposed and maybe a benefit spilled over. You don't really impose benefits on people. But the whole idea is that these are costs and benefits that go out to other people who had no role. They're not buyers, they're not sellers, they're bystanders. They are neutral in this transaction, but they are affected by the transaction. Negative externalities are costs, and positive externalities are benefits. When you decide to leave your house or leave your apartment, and it's under a voluntary quarantine, a situation where it's supposed to practice social distancing, or even more extreme versions of that, when you decide to do that, you are suffering a cost yourself, but there is an additional cost that you are putting on other people. Like the cost yourself is all the normal costs of going out. And then maybe some additional costs of you might hurt people that like you might not go see a grandparent or someone who's very vulnerable because you don't want to infect them, and you will feel bad if such a thing happened. Right? That would be a cost that's internalized, in addition to all the normal costs of gas and time and all those things. But The externality is on the cost that you also impose on strangers. The fact that you are going out really quick to get something from a store, or visit a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or take a walk when you don't really need to, especially if it's in a crowded area. These are costs that you are increasing the danger to people who are around you at that time. And because they're strangers, you don't necessarily factor in their concerns. It's not because you're a bad person. Right? We can only care about so many people, right? Our brains are just these primitive things. You can't think about everyone at the same time. It doesn't make us a bad person for not weighing a stranger in the same way that we would weigh a loved one, that we would think about a stranger in the same way we think about a loved one. That doesn't make us bad people. But because of that, if we recognize that reality, people are more likely to go out into the world when they really shouldn't, and there is a cost that they impose onto others when they do so. A classic example of a negative externality is pollution. It's easiest to see it with pollution. Imagine, for example, a power plant. And the power plant is generating electricity. And there are people who are benefiting from that electricity, the consumers, and there are people who are benefiting from the selling that electricity, the producers. But there is an additional cost into creating that electricity that neither the buyer nor the seller necessarily have to deal with. That increased air pollution, which hurts people, is not factored into this price of electricity. Right? There is an additional cost onto society that the electrical generation creates that people suffer. Sometimes they suffer it in this very direct sense, like the air pollution or the water pollution that people downhill or nearby have to suffer, or in the larger sense of its contribution to global warming. Okay. These are examples of negative externalities. That's a clear example. Noise pollution is another such example as well. Antibiotics is another example. You get an antibiotic to cure something that you're suffering from, and that's great for you, and that's great for the person who sold you the antibiotic. But when you do that, you help develop antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria. You help develop antibiotic-resistant strains of diseases. And there are some diseases who, because we've used antibiotics over so much, since we've invented them, because it's kind of this miracle cure, the evolution has favored then certain diseases that are resistant to the antibiotics, and there are certain diseases out there that can't be cured anymore with antibiotics, at least not easily, or at all. And so every antibiotic that you take increases the likelihood that one of these diseases comes out. That makes a cost for everyone else. And in this time of COVID-19, granted it's a virus, not a bacteria, but that same basic idea applies. This concern about disease. And at the very least, it applies most directly because going out is a form of pollution. And if you want to think in terms of negative externality as pollution in lots of different forms, that's a great way to think of it. Your actions make strangers worse off. Right? Not because you hate them. It's not vindictive. It's just a natural consequence of the action. It's a spillover. I give a couple other examples in the notes. People who dress really terribly, they might make some people really upset because they're ugly to look at, or ugly buildings, another such example. Crying babies, another such example. Clear noise pollution, fashion pollution, right? Various kinds of pollution. A positive externality are benefits that spill over to other people. There you do something, and because you do it, even if you're only thinking of yourself, right, other people are made better off. So I plant sunflowers on my deck. I like the sunflowers. They make me happy. My kids like them too. And so those are the things I'm thinking of when I plant them. But I also have to recognize as an economist that it's possible other people in my neighborhood, because they can see the sunflowers from the deck, they also benefit. It's nice to see those things. But I don't necessarily consider their benefit when I decide to plant them. So it's the opposite of a negative externality. It's not a cost, it's a benefit that you impose onto others. It's a benefit that other people enjoy. I say some flowers because sometimes people are planting them specifically to help others. If you are planting them as a form of charity or attraction, that's not really a positive externality. That is a donation, because you are considering other people. The whole point of a positive externality is that you are not considering other people. Let me give you another example, vaccines. If you get a vaccine for a disease, such as the flu, you are less likely to get the flu. But because you are less likely to get the flu, you are less likely to infect others. And so there is this spillover benefit to strangers. You are probably not thinking, I need to get the flu shot because I really don't want to get Bill on the subway sick, right? You don't think that. Okay. Hopefully they come out with a vaccine for COVID-19 soon. A lot of people will get it, but their goal, their mentality is probably not going to be, I want to make sure other people don't get it. It's probably going to be, I don't want to make sure I don't get it. Maybe they're considering, I don't want to make sure my loved ones don't get it, but they're not thinking in terms of the whole of society when they make that decision. And even if some people are, most people aren't. Right? If they are, then it's a form of charity. And a positive externality is not charity. When you give money to a stranger, that is not a positive externality. That is you being nice to somebody. Maybe you were clearly motivated to do that for whatever internal motivation, just to make you feel good, or to set an example for others, or whatever your internal motivation is. When you give somebody money, you are doing it in this, like the person who is receiving it is part of the transaction. They are not external to the transaction. Eliminating a negative externality is not a positive externality. It's not a matter of everything is either a negative or a positive externality. There are negative externalities, and there are positive externalities, but there's also neutral. Just because we eliminate this doesn't mean we go here. Can go to this neutral state instead. This is a positive externality. There are positive externalities, there are negative externalities, and then there's nothing at all. This like neutral state, right? Most purchases, there's no positive or negative externality. If you buy something from a store, or you order something online, and you purchase a water bottle, both parties are made better off, but you, as an individual, a total stranger, you are not made worse off by me purchasing this. You are not made better off by me purchasing this. You're neutral. You don't care. So most things are like that, right? I don't know how you spend your money, but generally I'm not made worse off or better off based on how you spent it. It's really crucial to keep this in mind, because we sometimes see this mistake in policymakers. Like, driving a car clearly creates a negative externality. So some people say, I know what we need to do. We need to encourage people to ride bikes. That's a bike. So I draw a lot more cars. I don't know what's going on. Oh wait, there's that right there. That's probably there. Yeah. Okay. So we'll say, I know what we're gonna do. We're gonna like give people bikes, or we're gonna encourage them to buy bikes, or we're gonna make them really cheap. Well, you are encourage people away from this negative externality, and that's fine. That doesn't mean you want to encourage them to bikes. You are picking a winner, right? It's not like there's anything special about bikes. Yes, they do stop this. They do stop the pollution. They do reduce the pollution. But so does walking. So does not going anywhere. So does skateboarding. Okay? So by targeting only bicycles, you are sort of declaring that there is something special about this. Because it's not. It's not like bikes specifically create a positive externality. There's nothing special about bikes. It's not like when you drive a bike, it like emits this really pleasant odor that you would like to see all over the city. This can actually lead to some unintended consequences because some people take this, like the governments will take this idea and replace the idea of bikes with the idea of hybrid cars. They're like, I know what we're going to do. We're going to subsidize hybrid cars to encourage people to use them because it's better than using this. And while it is better than using this, you're assuming you are pulling people away from conventional cars toward hybrids. Hybrids are not perfect. Hybrids still pollute. They just pollute less. You shouldn't be encouraging hybrids. You should be discouraging conventional automobiles, and then let people figure out. Because by specifically encouraging hybrids, yes, there'll be fewer people driving conventional vehicles, but there'll also be fewer people walking, maybe, than they would. A few people taking bicycles, and those create no pollution. So you want to be careful about picking winners as a way to solve an externality, a negative externality. That's kind of created its own problems. That creates a sort of subsidy problem that we talked about last video. All right, the market works fine. Bikes may not have a negative externality, but they don't have a positive externality either. They're just there. And now you're creating deadweight loss by encouraging too many bicycles. That's going to be, by the way, a big theme in the next video when we talk about solving externalities, using taxes and subsidies to solve externalities. But right now, let's just get the idea. Let's just make sure that we're aware. I also want to add, too, that while it's true that a positive externality does not include acts of charity, you could argue pretty well that an act of theft or vandalism is a negative externality. In all likelihood, like the person who is stealing something isn't necessarily considering how you are made worse off, but they certainly are considering how you're made better off when they give something to you. Clearly, a cost is imposed, is forced on you when you are a victim of crime. But a benefit is not imposed on you when someone gives you money, right? You take that money, you accept it, but you don't accept the crime. So we can formalize this idea of negative versus positive externality in diagram form, as economists like to do. For negative externality, we are going to recognize that there is an additional cost imposed on society. So there is a private supply curve, and then there is a social supply curve. And because this social supply curve includes not just you, the individual, the person who is acting, that's what the private supply curve is. It also includes the externality, that vertical distance, everyone else. This is the quantity we would like to see. If there was a negative externality, this is the quantity we would like to see. But this is the quantity we have. The individual only does this. But there is an equilibrium. What we would like to see is a higher price and a lower quantity. The optimal is all the way back here. Note this vertical distance that I have here is the size of the externality. This is everyone else. This is the thing that the actor, the person who is acting, cares about. And then this is the whole of society. And the difference between them is everyone who is not the actor. So you can think of the social supply curve equals the private supply curve plus the externality. In this case, a negative externality because it's the supply curve. So we take the social supply curve, so the private supply curve. So we take the private supply curve plus the negative externality, gives us the social supply curve. Even though it's negative, we add it because it's a bad thing, it's a cost. Remember, it is a cost imposed onto others. So the cost of someone's action is here, but the actual total cost is higher. Okay, the tricky part is finding deadweight loss. So we note that there is this distinction. We are producing too much. There is too much. So the way to figure out is we're going to highlight what determines the optimal. The social, and then of course our generic demand curve. And then we look at what we're doing, and best way to do it is to just draw a vertical line straight up, or just draw a dotted line straight up. And this is our deadweight loss, because there is a cost that is greater than the benefit. So appreciate too what this means. This means that when we see a negative externality, that does not necessarily mean that the goal is to eliminate the activity entirely. Like, global warming is a real problem, but no one's going to argue that the optimal amount of pollution is literally zero. You shouldn't go outside during the COVID-19 outbreak. You should practice the social distancing, but that does not mean that literally you should never leave under all circumstances. If someone breaks their leg, you should not be like, I can't go outside, right? I can't call the ambulance, I can't help somebody, right? There are these circumstances, and exactly when those circumstances are does depend on the externality. It is possible, it's mathematically possible, that the externality is so large that the optimal really is zero. That's entirely possible. But usually that doesn't happen. A positive externality has an imposed benefit on others, something that spills over onto other people. So that means it is not an additional, that means it's not additional cost, it is an additional benefit. So we look at demand. So this is our private demand. This is what people naturally do, or QE. But there is a higher social demand, and thus a higher optimal quantity. Just like before, the difference between the private and the social is the size of the externality. This is the size of the positive externality, just that this is the size of the negative externality. I know it's getting a little crowded on this board. I wanted you to be able to see the two of them side by side, especially as we find deadweight loss. This is where we would like to be. This is where we are. This is what matters here. This is what we care about here. And so we are not exchanging, we are not producing and consuming, we are not creating the flower bed, even though the social benefits exceed the costs. Here we have too much, the quantity is too high. Here, the quantity is too low. And note this makes sense, right? It makes sense that we have too much pollution because people aren't considering the full costs. We have too few vaccinations because people aren't considering the full benefits. Again, this doesn't mean that the externality is so high that there should be flower beds everywhere. It does depend on the size of the externality, just as it depends on the size of the externality here. But that basic idea that when we see a market failure, when we see an externality and we want to correct it, we should be aware that it's possible to overcorrect. That if we're trying to combat global warming, the goal is to not have absolutely zero pollution whatsoever. That's probably not optimal. So again, it's about costs, it's about benefits, it's about trade-offs, and figuring out exactly how to solve it is something we'll be talking about in the next video.